Morning, evening, afternoon, everybody. I know you're all coming in. Participants, wow, everybody's coming in mass. I mean, it goes from 10 to 20 to 30. It'll be 300 people before we know it this Friday morning, evening, afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Look, my hand is actually mirroring the emoji. That's how you know we're super cool here. We can do all kinds of emojis. I do an eyeball pop out emoji. I do all the emojis to help inspire trust and reduce harm. Because that is what's going to happen today, ladies and gentlemen. You are going to learn how to design for trust and safety with the one, the only Karl Purcell. He is our Irishman in San Diego. It happens. They let Irish people live in San Diego. I don't know why, but he has been allowed to be a part of the San Diego community and the Irrational Labs community, and he's here to enlighten you today. So you are in for a treat. It is going to be awesome. But before we do this, let's get the party started. We are interested in knowing a little bit about you and what's going on with you. So to those ends, we're going to launch a poll. And boy, did we put all our brains into this poll today. So, Karl, I think we decided it is, we have a lot of, we have polls here now. I think it's, I'm looking. We have a lot. I have to see. It's big two, I think. It's the big two.
Think it's the big two.
It's the big two, yeah. Yeah, so there are two big questions for you. They're not small, they're big. We're just kind of interested in what the biggest B-side challenges you're facing are. We're going to kind of come to some of these during the presentation. I will be kicking some of these back to Karl in the chat so we can talk about them during the presentation today. But please, if you have a second, answer those questions in the poll. We'd love to hear what's the one key challenge that if you could unlock it would drive business impact for you. And then how is AI most likely to impact your business in terms of trust and safety? Obviously on topic for today's presentation. With that said, for those of you new to the Irrational Labs universe, we're not Marvel or DC, but we are pretty cool. We've worked with hundreds of the top organizations to bring the behavioral design approach into their processes. You may notice some of these logos, they may be familiar. We are not superheroes, but if we were, our origin story starts back at Google, where we designed the behavioral economics business unit that worked with over 25 teams over a decade ago. Since then, we've run over 100 experiments, and we've trained thousands of people in the secrets and mysteries of behavioral design. So, if you have not plugged in, we'll be dropping information on our newsletter, on Kristen's Substack, and all the cool ways to stay with us and hang with us. There are three incredible ways to use behavioral insights to innovate and grow. First and foremost, product design. Most of the people we work with, we help them with behavioral change and product design. Secondly, behavioral science training. We often work with large organizations and small organizations to get everybody skilled up on what BSI can do for you, your organization, your product, your service, your customer, your health, your happiness, and your well-being. And lastly, we've been at the cutting edge of kind of AI integration, AI work, AI and behavioral science in all levels of all organizations. I will tell you though, everybody here today from Irrational Labs is actually human. None of us are bots, to my knowledge. So before we get started, again, please answer those questions in the chat, or in the poll, I should say. But let me tell you about Karl. He is one of my favorite people at Irrational Labs, and I like everybody at Irrational Labs, but Karl is a standout. Why? Why? Because he's a passionate advocate for behavioral science. And I love this. He built a number of behavioral science teams throughout his career, but for real, he built the behavioral science team in the country of Ireland, and then we acquired him. He believes that by combining rapid experimentation with a deep understanding of human behavior, organizations can help people become healthier, happier, and wealthier. Prior to working at Rational Labs, he played a key role in driving the adoption of behavioral science in Irish policymaking. He worked with Ireland's Department of Finance, the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, and Ireland's National Public Health and Emergency Team to use behavioral science to deliver research projects, RCTs, that's cool people for randomized controlled trials, and design impactful tools and solutions for the entire country. He received his master's in behavioral science from management from the University of Stirling, and his behavior and his bachelor, the BSc always throws me off, in business and finance from Dublin City University. Karl also holds a higher diploma in science and data analytics from the Dublin Business School. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm all about the ado. I don't want to have further ado, but let's just hand this screen share over to Karl so he can blow your minds and inspire you with trust and prove that he's not a robot today. Let's give him a warm welcome. Brenda, good to see you from Mexico City. I'm now just looking to see who I know. Who else do I know? Some of the good people are here. Tony Francisco. I hope you're in San Francisco. Awesome. Well, great to have everybody here, Karl. Take it away.
Likewise, and thanks, Ryan. And yeah, hopefully when you acquired me from Ireland, that was like a decent position in the draft pick. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
But
I didn't want to say anything, but we did have a rough season and you were kind of like, but whatever. We're still happy to have you. We're very grateful.
look, I'm here in sunny San Diego now, so that's all that matters. Yeah, like Ryan said, it's super great to see a couple of familiar faces, even from my days back in Ireland, I think, looking at some of the names in the chat. So welcome to everyone I know, and welcome to everyone that I'm yet to get to know. Ryan's right. Today we're going to be talking about how do we build trust and safety by design, and so I'm going to basically run through some behavioral science strategies for managing AI risks and everyday product challenges that trust and safety teams face. But let's try and keep this super interactive, right? We've got about an hour together today. And so instead of me just talking at you, I think it'll be more fun if we do a couple of things. So first of all, please play along with any of the live questions that we post. So I'll be asking you to predict results from some of the studies we're going to share, asking you about how different trust and safety features work on your platforms. Please feel free to post the answers in the chat. Introduce yourself in the chat. There's lots of people here from the trust and safety world, so it's a good opportunity to get a sense of who's in the room and maybe even say hello to some people that you know yourself. So please do introduce yourself with your role in the chat. And then, like I mentioned, please feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go as well. My beautiful assistant, Ryan, will be keeping an eye on that as we go, and he'll be teeing up some interesting questions for me as we go through the presentation. And then, of course, getting a sense of which ones we should prioritize as well for the Q&A at the end.
Oh, by the way, Karl, that's my new name is Karl's beautiful assistant. Thank you.
Awesome. I am going to ask you to saw someone in half at some point, so please practice.
Okay, I'll be doing that right now. Carry on.
Awesome. So what we're going to talk about today, I'll skip over the who we are a little bit quickly because Ryan covered a lot of that. We're going to jump straight in and talk about why is behavioral science important for trust and safety teams. And for those who aren't as familiar with behavioral science, I'll give a quick definition. Then we're going to spend the bulk of our time together talking about how behavioral science can help trust and safety teams by looking at some really cool case studies and some exciting new interventions that have come up through the literature recently. We'll talk a little bit about how AI is likely going to impact trust and safety teams. And then finally, like I mentioned, I want to leave a good 10, 15 minutes at the end for a healthy Q&A. So please keep those questions coming. So like Ryan mentioned, we're Rational Labs. We use behavioral science to increase health, wealth, and happiness. We've worked with a bunch of top players across big tech, health, and finance. But really importantly, what we're here to talk about today is our work in the trust and safety space. And I want to give you a little flavor of that up front. And I'll go into a lot more detail on this when we go through the full case study. But just to give you an idea of some of our work in this space, some of the work we're most proud of in trust and safety that we've done is with TikTok on trying to reduce the spread of misinformation. And so what we did with TikTok was we did a full end-to-end behavioral diagnosis, design, and experiment testing an intervention to try and reduce the sharing of misinformation on the platform. You can see what the final intervention looked like on the right, and I'll bring you through all of the good psychology that went into that in a few minutes. But just to say that this was successful, and when we tested this in a real-world experiment with TikTok, this was successful in reducing the sharing of flagged content by 24%. And why am I telling you this? The real reason that I'm telling you this is just to say that we are mission aligned when it comes to trust and safety work. So I've been with Rational Labs, I think, about 3 years and a bit now, depending on when my draft pick actually happened. And I can tell you that during my time here, I think I've worked on 4 or 5 trust and safety projects, and they've been some of the more meaningful projects that I've gotten a chance to work on. And if you think about why that is, right? Like, we're spending more and more time online. Stuff that we do online is spilling out into the real world, as we're seeing in many different ways these days. And of course, I also just had a child in the last 10 months. And so I know that he's probably going to spend more time online as he grows up. And for all these reasons, I think it's important that we get this stuff as right as we can, right? It's a challenging space. We're always going to make mistakes to some degree, but let's try and build communities online that solve for positive trust and safety outcomes as best we can. And I think behavioral science is a real strong tool to add to our toolkit in order to try and get to that outcome. So Ryan said a little bit about me, so I won't bore you with my background, and I'll just give you a little personal anecdote of what I'm up to this evening. So I'm actually Irish, as Ryan mentioned, right? I'm not a bot. And there's a big fight on tonight, a big boxing fight. Does anyone know the fight that I'm talking about?
Carl and
Right?
I were thinking about fighting tonight, but we knew this other fight was on, so it wasn't going to be a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, they totally pipped us there right at the post. It's really annoying. Like Ryan and I had this really awesome white collar boxing event on, and Anthony Sanchez, me and my wife. I hope not, Anthony. I hope you have a nice, peaceful evening with your wife. But yeah, someone said Mike Tyson. That's right. That's the main card, right? Mike Tyson versus Jake Paul. But also Irish fighter Katie Taylor, who won Ireland's Olympic gold boxing medal a couple of years ago, is fighting Serrano tonight. And for her, that's a big fight because she's the only person who's ever gotten close to beating her. So encourage you to check that out. Gonna be an interesting one. All right, let's jump into the real stuff. Why should behavioral science be something that trust and safety teams care about? Why do trust and safety teams need behavioral science? First off, let me acknowledge, like I already mentioned, that trust and safety teams have a really hard job, right? If you do too much, you're criticized. If you don't do enough, you're criticized. And that criticism comes from all sorts of angles. And you're trying to do all of this in a really kind of across a wide range of issues while you're trying to solve for some really complex behaviors. And we'll get specific about that now. But I think first off, just to acknowledge that it's a tough space to work in. And so the more tools that we have in order to tackle these challenges, I think the better. Let's have a look at some of these issues, right? So first off, we have youth safety and well-being. Like I mentioned, I just had a child of my own, and I think everyone here is going to be equally full-throated in saying that we want to keep people, especially young people, very safe online, right? And we want to keep them away from potentially harmful content. And equally, more families are thinking about how they can do things like limit their children's screen time, right? This is a really complex and thorny problem. And we do things like build really great features like family pairing that can help parents do this. But after we spend this time and effort building these great features, often we find that they have much lower adoption rates than we would like. And behavioral science has a lot to say about how do you capture people's attention? How do you introduce a new feature so that people understand it and use it regularly? And how do you design that feature in order to make it easy for people to use? When it comes to the area of hate speech and civil discourse, I think very much unfortunately, at least it feels this way, we're seeing a trend towards more hate speech online and maybe less civil discourse online, particularly in certain communities. And we don't want that, right? We want communities where people can have active and lively discussion while keeping things civil. And obviously, we don't want the proliferation of hate speech. And so if we're going to do things like that, we need to do things like encourage people to flag hate speech at a greater rate than they currently do, right? Most users currently don't report content, and detection models are never going to catch everything. So it's likely as we go forward, we're going to need more people to flag more content, not less. And then, of course, in the area of misinformation, right, more and more people are getting their news from social media, especially young people. And so it's really important to reduce misinformation and its impact as much as we can. And we'll talk about that as we go through the TikTok case study in a few minutes. If we're going to do this, I think it's true enough to say that trust and safety teams really have to understand what is driving this behavior. Why are people either engaging in harmful behaviors like posting hate speech? And why are people not engaging with features that we built, for example, right? And if we're going to have any chance of really successfully changing these behaviors, we need to understand how people make decisions first. Because if we do, then we can design online environments, right, that are going to push people towards the type of change that we want to see, the positive outcomes that we care so much about. And this is why behavioral science is so useful, right? It's the study of decision making. It tries to understand, why do people make the choices they do? And why do they engage in the behavior that they do, or in some cases, the behavior that they don't engage in, right? And once we have a good understanding of that, we can apply a method that we call behavioral design, which is where we say, okay, let's take those insights from that academic and applied literature and turn that into discrete design choices that we can make in our online platforms to produce the change that we want to see. It's very hard for me to boil the concept of behavioral design down to like some key tenets, right? There's lots of different factors. It very much depends on the unique context that we're working in, and we always take that into account. But it's fair to say first that these are probably three of the big tenets of behavioral design, which is the first is that we don't assume people always behave perfectly rationally, right? We don't assume that people are always going to sit down and read every piece of content or policy guideline that we produce. We don't always assume that people are going to kind of coldly and calculatedly evaluate their options, right? Instead, what we need to do is try and identify the key psychologies that might be driving a person's behavior at a given time in a given context and solve for that. Similarly, I think a lot of the time, particularly in trust and safety interventions, we think about, let's give people more information, right? If they're more informed, then they'll understand why they should or should not do this thing, and they'll change their behavior. That's not fully true, I think. I think information is an important element, but it's not enough on its own, right? People need to know what they need to do differently. They need to know how to do it. They have to have the capability, and they need to have the motivation to change in the first place, right? And some of the ways that we can do that more effectively rather than just providing information is to change the decision environment. So change how our screens are designed, change the copy that we use, change the buttons that we ask people to use, introduce new features. These are all things that can drive behavior. And then finally, not just focus on changing minds, right? A lot of the time we think about, oh, well, do we want to be even changing people's attitudes or minds? And in this case, it's easier and more effective most of the time to almost avoid that question to some degree and say, what we should really be doing is acknowledging that, yes, people have attitudes and preferences and beliefs, and that shapes their behavior. But what we should be focused on is solving for the behavior. What is it that we actually want them to do that drives the outcomes we care about, right? Do we want them to flag more content? Do we want them to unfollow certain people? Do we want them to post more positive content, for example? Whatever it is, if we start with the assumption that we're solving for the behavior and not the attitude underlying the behavior, we can often make more discrete changes to the product that are likely to have an impact. All right, let's get into the exciting stuff. And so here, I'm really going to encourage you to play along. There's going to be a bunch of poll questions that I'm going to ask. And we're going to look at some case studies and exciting new interventions from the academic literature that can be applied in products to try and improve trust and safety outcomes. So let's get into the fun stuff. We're going to talk about three big behavioral science strategies that can be used to improve these outcomes. The first is using friction wisely to change behavior. So sometimes we want to add friction and slow people down and get them into that more reflective state. And other times, actually, we need to do the opposite. We need to remove friction and get out of people's way and make it easier for them to engage in the healthy behavior we want them to engage in. The second thing we're going to talk about is how do we direct attention and boost people's capabilities using things like timely reminders, call-outs, and just-in-time interactive tutorials to make sure that people actually have the ability to change once they've decided they do want to. And then third, we're going to look at how do we provide clear and actionable feedback that builds strong and positive norms on our platforms. I think a lot of the time, people don't get a lot of great feedback through social media, right? Yes, you get views, yes, you get likes and you get comments, but often when people engage in like harmful behavior or maybe even potentially harmful behavior, there's not a lot of feedback that directly tells you this is why this is wrong and this is how you should do this instead. And we might need to do more of that. We'll talk about some examples that do that. Ryan, any questions in the chat that I should answer? I'm going to use this pause to take in a little bit of water here.
No, you do need to stay hydrated since we're going to have to postpone our fight till next month. So I want you to be at kind of the peak for that. No, I'm actually taking the poll results. I'm looking through people's AI challenges, but this is a good interruption for me to say I may relaunch the poll because it looks like if you came in after we started, you didn't have access to it. So I'm pulling those results and I'll relaunch it in a little bit. So carry on.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I mean, it's no big deal. I was going to make weight, like 100% was going to make weight, but it's not a big deal.
Yeah, well, I mean, dude, I'm huge. So at 230 pounds, I mean, I look lighter, but whatever. I'm a super heavyweight. But yeah, anyways, you look tough today. Come on now.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. All right, before I start getting into shadowboxing and all other stuff, let's get straight into the behavioral science instead. Let's talk about some ways that we can use friction wisely to change behavior. And I'm going to bring you through that case study from TikTok that I talked about a little bit at the start, but in a little bit more detail this time. What I want to do is explain kind of how did we approach this problem with TikTok to get the successful result that we did. And when we try and apply this concept of behavioral design, we approach it with kind of 5 main steps in mind. The first of which is problem immersion. So of course, we're coming into a context, right, when we're working with someone like TikTok, where we want to deeply understand everything they already know about this problem. So what types of misinformation do people share? What is the extent of sharing of that type of information on the platform? Where does that happen? And then, of course, we want to complement that as well with existing knowledge from outside of the client that we might be working with. And we do that usually through a literature review, where we'll say, what does the academic evidence actually tell us about what are some effective treatments for trying to solve this problem? Once we've done that, we'll do what we call a behavioral map, where we actually think about what are every single step, both logistically and cognitively, that someone has to take to go from the point of where they sign up for a platform like TikTok to where they might share a piece of misinformation. And at each of those points, what are the key psychologies that are driving people's choices, right? And once we have a sense of those two things, then and only then do we get into solution design, and we say, okay, let's think of 5, 10 different ways that we might be able to solve this problem, rate them by impact and effort, and then pre-test them. And this is the real secret sauce, right? When we pre-test our ideas, we can whittle down and start to see ideas that show real great potential, and then hopefully also test them in product to get a real sense of, did they have real world impact? So this is exactly what we did with TikTok. We started with that behavioral mapping and data audit that I mentioned, right? And you can see here, we literally start at where people sign up for the platform and go all the way through to where someone might share a piece of content. We did an academic literature review, which in this case was hugely important because Gordon Pennycook and a couple of his co-authors had just released a paper at the time all about the fact that it's not that people really want to share inaccurate information. For sure, there are some bad actors that do want to do that, right? And we need appropriate remedies to deal with them. But for the typical average person, people actually don't want to share inaccurate information. It's just they're not always paying attention to the accuracy of the information in the moment because they're doing things so quickly in a hot state as they're moving through a fast platform like TikTok. And then, of course, we also look at what competitors in the space are doing, right? Trying to understand what other interventions are out there. Have they been successful? And this led us to a point where basically we came up with a bunch of ideas, right? Like I mentioned, you can see them in the smaller screens on the left, where basically we said, okay, we think the way to solve this problem is to have a warning label and some sort of intervention that gets people to slow down. And you can see a couple of versions that we wanted to try here, right? We had a label that says caution, video flagged for inaccurate content. We had another one that actually asked people to engage and said, how confident are you that this is accurate? And they could say, I'm not, or I'm slightly, or I'm very confident. Right? And then, of course, we had a version of the final intervention that you see here. Are you sure you want to share? Reflect before engaging. And what we did was we pre-tested that with about 1,000 TikTok users out of product in an online experiment with people who use TikTok regularly. We complemented that with some qualitative work, and that basically led us to the design that you see on the right. Let me break down why this design was so effective in this particular case. I think it was for a couple of reasons, but at the highest level, what we were really trying to do was move people from a situation where they're in like this hot state, right? They're scrolling quickly through TikTok, which is full of emotional and engaging content, sometimes enraging content, right? And we want to move them to a more cold state where they're thinking and reflecting about, do I actually want to share this? And this is where friction comes in, right? We're able to slow them down with a little bit of good friction, and by asking them to make what we would call an active choice, where they have to make some choice before they can move on. And so you get the warning label on the left first, calling people's attention to the fact that this might be inaccurate. And then you get the slow down bit in the right? You get people say, are you sure you want to share this video? It was flagged for unverified content. You can either cancel or share anyway. They're your two choices. When we tested this, we rolled it out with TikTok as part of an in-product experiment. We saw a reduction in shares of unverified content by about 24%, right? Without reducing engagement on the platform as a whole. So a massive win. And then we also, to be careful, we continued to analyze its impact as it was rolled out globally. And again, we saw similar impacts as it was scaled up and rolled out across the globe. And this is great, right? If you think about it, like trust and safety teams, they work so hard on these problems. It's often very hard to get a win. And so when you get a win like this, it's important to kind of shout it from the rooftops a little bit. And that's what we did with this case study. Ryan's going to share a link just to share some of the positive coverage that this case study got. But this is a clear win,
listen,
right?
Karl. Bashar did it before I could.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, Bashar. Thank you very much.
Yeah, her reflexes are a little faster than mine. You know what I'm saying?
Hit the speed bag, Ryan. Hit the speed bag. Come on.
We're not in the same age group, just the same weight.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Carry on. This boxing extended joke is just silly to us, but we're just gonna roll with it.
Roll with the point. No, I'll stop. I'll stop. Sorry. All right, back to the behavioral science. Friction can be good, like we're talking about, right? It can help us, it can help people slow down, but it can get in the way of some of the positive behaviors we want to encourage as well, right? And so let's think about a different question. How can we encourage more reporting of potentially harmful content? I think an important question. A piece of research that was done by Ofgem in the UK in 2023 as part of this study showed that only 2 in 10 users had ever reported content on the platforms that they use regularly. 2 out of 10, right? That's really small. If you think about, like, unfortunately, people are likely going to be coming across content that is either actually harmful or that they feel is potentially harmful, but most people are not reporting that content. So how can we encourage them to actually take action and report it instead? Well, Ofgem did a very nice experiment. And what they did was they took about, I think it was around 1,000 participants, but I might be slightly wrong on those numbers. And they randomly assigned them to one of 3 conditions as part of an out-of-product experiment. So in this online experiment, participants were basically shown a bunch of different videos, but the designs of the screen they were interacting with while they were watching those videos was slightly different. In the control group on the left, what you can see is that basically the reporting button was placed behind the ellipses, right? So you'd have to click on the ellipses there in the bottom right-hand corner of that screen, and then click a flag button to say, oh, okay, I want to report this piece of potentially harmful content. In the middle option, which they call reduced friction, right? They basically just said, let's remove that friction of having to go into the menu, and they just put the flag button right there on the screen. In the reduced friction and prompt condition on the right, they went a step further and they said, okay, we're going to put that flag right on the screen to make it easy. And if people engage with this video in a different way, like by liking it or by commenting on it, we're going to prompt them to consider whether or not they should actually report this piece of content, right? Before I show you the answers, I want to do a quick little game of play along like I was talking about at the start. So please put your answers in the chat here. This is a question for you about the platform that you work on. Where is the report button located on your platform right now? Is it A, on the screen alongside all of the other main buttons that people use typically? Or is it behind another action or menu, like a long press, or behind like an ellipses, like in the example? Please put your answers in the chat. I'll take a little look as people are answering. B, 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 B. Okay, a lot of people going with B behind some other action or menu. I think the reason that I'm asking you to commit these answers before I show you the results is you can probably guess which direction these results are going in, right? Like I framed it up in a certain way. You probably know which way the results are going to go. I think what's hard to appreciate is the scale and the size of these effects, with the caveat that this is an out-of-product experiment, but still the size of the effects, right? Have a look at this. This is the actual effect that we see. When you reduce friction and when you make it salient with the prompt as well, in particular, right, at key times, this can increase reporting significantly from 2% of potentially harmful content being reported to 22% of potentially harmful content videos being reported, right? Again, I will caveat, obviously, that this is an out-of-product experiment, so maybe these exact numbers would change in product. They probably would. But the scale of the impact, right, it's large. And so I think it's really important to reflect for you, why is your report button, and as I saw in the chat for a lot of you, behind another menu? Why is it behind another action, like a long press, for example? Maybe it does need prominence in place alongside the other key actions that people take every day, like liking and commenting. All right, let's talk about the second way that we can apply behavioral science to try and improve these outcomes. And this is about really trying to direct attention and boosting people's capabilities to do the right thing at the right time. We can do this with timely reminders, with callouts, and with just-in-time interactive tutorials. Again, I'm going to draw on the great work of Ofgem here. And this time they were trying to answer a slightly different question. They were saying, how can we try and help users build the skills that they need right when they need them and know when to use them? And in this experiment, what they did was, again, slightly different from the last one. They said, we're going to ask people to watch a bunch of videos on a kind of replicated video platform. And those people can engage or not engage with them as they normally would. So you could comment on them, skip them, like them, anything, or you could just completely just ignore them if that's what you wanted to do, right? You had about 2,000 users here that were involved in this experiment. They were basically brought in, explained a little bit of background behind the experiment, randomized to one of 4 groups that we'll look at now, and then asked to watch 6 videos, 3 of which included potentially harmful content and 3 of which did not. And then they were given a reporting task to see if they wanted to report any of those videos. And again, like I mentioned, they measured all of the outcomes that they could, right? So reported number of videos reported, comments, likes, skips, everything you can imagine. The 4 different conditions that people were exposed to are these. We had a control group, right, where people were not given a micro tutorial, right? They were just given a baseline for comparison. They just watched the videos and then engage with them as they would. There was a static tutorial where they were just explained, here are the buttons, here's what they do, just in this image that you can see on the right. There was a video tutorial group where there was a video kind of explaining, here's all the different features that you can use and how they work. And then the 4th group was an interactive tutorial where they would say, okay, we're actually going to guide you through clicking these buttons and seeing what happens when you do and explaining why you should do that. Before I show you the results, let's play another little game. Which of the following best describes how safety features are introduced on your current onboarding experience today? A, B, C, or D? Do you currently offer no tutorial, a static tutorial, a video tutorial, or an interactive tutorial? And I'm thinking particularly about like your most important trust and safety features here, right? Like maybe family pairing, maybe flagging, and maybe like blocking someone, for example, right? So think about those and then answer in the chat, A, B, C, or D, what approach do you use right now? Okay, seeing. And excuse me, I think I said off gem earlier on, and it's actually off com. I apologize for that misquote earlier on. So great work that we were drawing on from off com there. Apologies. I got overexcited with my boxing analogies. I see a mix of answers here. I see A, I see a lot of Bs, and then I see some Cs as well. So a bunch of different options, but no option D. Again, this great work, and I think I've even gotten it wrong in the citation, so apologies Ofcom, and I think there's someone actually here from Ofcom, so very much apologies. I will fix this in the slides before we share them anywhere, rest assured. What we see here is when you give micro tutorials just in time, this can actually boost reporting significantly. So in the control group, you get about 4% of people, right, who are reporting at least one of the potentially harmful videos. And in the interactive tutorial group, this increases all the way to 23%. So a significant effect here. Again, I want to caveat this and say this is an out-of-product online experiment, but it goes to show, right, the size of these potential effects. And again, given that most people were answering in the chat options A, B, or C, right, and not this option D, it's worth thinking about why are we not using interactive tutorials, and maybe we should be. All right, let's move on to the 3rd strategy, which is trying to provide clear and actionable feedback to people so that we can build healthy norms on our platforms. A question for everybody here. What percentage of users do you think have never read the community guidelines for the platforms they use regularly? I think this is also another Ofcom study that I'm drawing on here. And again, I'm pretty sure I've made that citation mistake, so apologies again. Once you make that mistake, you just copy and paste it, right? So I really apologize for that one. But what do you think? What percentage of users do you think have never read community guidelines for the platforms they use regularly? A, B, C, or D? D. Someone answered an option E. I'm curious to think what your option E is. I see some Bs. I see some Cs. The answer here is actually B. It's about 38%. Oh, I got the citation right this time. Thank God. All right, so more than 1 in 3 users here, 38%, say they never check community guidelines. And I think what's important to grasp about 38% here is that this is self-report, right? So it's just people saying what they're doing. People often inflate what they actually do, and so this figure could be higher. And also, when you take into account the fact that, you know, these community standards changed over time, the rules change. What I think it is fair to say is whether you're TikTok with community guidelines, Meta with a transparency center, or DoorDash with content guidelines, most of the time, most people are not familiar with these rules and don't have a good understanding of what is allowed on the platform and what is not allowed on the platform. And if that is true, which it likely is for a lot of users, then we need to do other things to give people feedback and help build healthy and positive norms, right? So let's look at a slightly different question here, drawing on some work from Volk that just came out in the last month or so. How can we reduce anti-democratic attitudes and partisan animosity online? This is part of fantastic work by a huge team of scientists where they randomly assign users to one of 25 different potential treatments to affect these outcomes, right? They did this with a huge sample of 5,601 adults that were representative of the US population from opt-in online panels, like I think, prolific in these type of panels. Again, similar kind of structure to the experiment. They had an introduction where people would be given a briefing about what they're about to be asked to do, randomized to one of the 25 treatments, and they would complete those treatments, and then they would report the outcomes. And the outcomes that they were measuring here were a bunch of different stuff, but they included a measure of partisan animosity. So how much animosity do you feel towards your political party, towards, more importantly, another political party that you might not support? People's support for undemocratic practices, people's support for partisan violence, and more, right? So some very important outcomes to think about given current context. The researchers, like I mentioned, tested 25 different treatments. This is a great mega study approach where they have a bunch of different people submit potential treatments, and then they whittle it down to, like, in this case, the 25 ideas that they test, and test them across with similar outcomes so that you compare the effectiveness across a standardized set of outcomes. I think to save everyone's sanity here, I'm not going to go through all 25 of those different treatments. I highly recommend you read this paper. It's great. But let's just look at 4 of them. So in the control group, we just had no treatment. People were just asked to come into the study, and they answered a bunch of questions about things like their level of partisan animosity and support for undemocratic practices and stuff like that. In the second group, what they did was they tried to correct people's democratic misperceptions. So for example, they will be asked things like, well, how much do you think, or what percentage of your political opponents support undemocratic actions, like, for example, challenging the results of a election or things like this? And then they were told what the actual correct percentage of people from that opposing party, how much they actually did or did not support that particular behavior. In group 3, they were told about the ineffectiveness of political violence. So participants would read a news article about how nonviolent protests are historically more effective than violent protests in bringing about social change. And they make sure that that was true when they told people that. And then in the 4th group, they tried to reduce out-party electoral threat by basically having participants read about how their party is currently dominating American politics now and will for the foreseeable future. And how they did this was they made sure to pick specific contexts where this was true for Democrats and specific contexts where this was true for Republicans at the time of this study to make sure, again, that this was all true and real. Okay, let's play a bit of a guessing game. Which of these 3 approaches do you think was most effective compared to the control group in terms of reducing partisan animosity? And you have 3 options here. You have correcting those misperceptions, you have showing the ineffectiveness of political violence, or reducing out-party electoral threat. C or A, C, 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 A, C. We have a good mix. So we have a good mix of C and A. No one's going for option B, but absolutely, that's all right. Let's have a little look. I'll reveal the results. It was actually option A. And not only was it option A, but options B and C had basically no impact on this particular outcome measure of partisan animosity. So what seemed to be effective, and this is true if you look at some of the other treatments that they tried that you kind of could broadly label as trying to give people feedback on norms and what other people actually think rather than what sometimes people assume their political opponents think. That was the most effective. It reduced feelings of partisan animosity by about 6% in this particular treatment, and with similar effect sizes when you look at this generalized approach. But what does this tell us? It tells us that if we give people feedback and help them actually correct their misperception and say, actually, it's not normal to support these things like political violence, or it's not normal to support things like undemocratic practices, people will actually shift and move in their attitudes a little bit, in particular around how they feel in terms of partisan animosity. This next study is looking at a really nice idea that I think needs to be tested in a real world environment, but has great potential. And what the authors are really interested in answering here is, can they use AI generated suggestions to provide clear and actionable feedback to try and reduce harmful speech when people are debating really contentious issues like gun control online? Let's take a look at this study and how they did it. So the main manipulation that you need to know about here is that people were engaging in basically a debate in a chat room with someone who politically opposed their idea. So in this case, we're going to use the example of gun control. So one person supports gun control, one person opposes it. And then they're randomly assigned to either just have this chat with no AI suggestions, so just completely on their own, have this chat with someone else. Or when they would type a message, before they would send that message, they would be offered AI-generated suggestions. So they would use a ChatGPT model to basically read what people had written. So in this case, something like guns are a stain on democracy. And then they would say, let's reframe what you've said. So let's not change your opinion. We're going to keep your opinion the same, but reframe how you're saying it, right? And they provide some alternatives. So for example, I think that gun laws should be more strict in order to protect people. What are your thoughts about that? I feel that guns are a stain on democracy, and so on. And then they could click whichever button they want. They could send their original message or one of these alternative messages. So again, just so we're all super clear, right? One person supports the issue, one person opposes it. They write a message. ChatGPT basically reinterprets that message while keeping the underlying feeling the same, or sorry, keeping the underlying message the same, but reinterprets it to either restate their issue by saying, I understand that you value, by being more polite, or by validating the other person's perspective by saying things like, I appreciate that you too want to protect democracy, right? And then you measure basically the effect of this on conversational quality and people's willingness to continue debating with each other. And what you find here is two really interesting things. One, participants actually accept this rephrasing quite often, 2/3 of the time, right? So the majority of the time, they're actually using the rephrased version versus then their own. And when they did that, it actually led to significant improvements in these measures of what they would call civil discourse, right? So this first measure of democratic reciprocity is this feeling that it's important to talk to people who have opposing viewpoints. They were able to increase that feeling by 2.5%. And the overall satisfaction that people had with the conversation's quality increased by 4%. And really importantly here, this was done without introducing bias, right? Remember, we did not change people's users' stated policy positions. We didn't take someone who opposed gun control and change what they'd said to make it seem like they actually supported gun control. We just reframed how they were saying it so that it was, or again, gave them the option to choose to say it in a more civil and polite manner. All right. I will take another little water break here and see if there's any burning questions before we talk about how AI is likely to impact trust and safety teams.
Yeah, Karl. So we didn't talk about the boxing intervention.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is that a good way to resolve conflict?
I think if you were to ask authors about political violence when they're organized boxing matches, I think they would clearly say no. But between me and you, Ryan, who already like each other and are doing it for a good cause, I think it's fine.
Okay, sounds good. And to everybody, I'm trying to drop the studies as Karl shares them, so make sure you're checking those in the chat. And additionally, at this break, I am going to do this again. I'm going to launch the poll again for those of you that came in late. We were really interested in kind of collecting your views on AI. So stay tuned. Oh, it looks like, okay. I'm going to see if I can relaunch this poll. So if you did not answer this poll earlier, please take a second. We'd love to know kind of what challenges you have around trust and safety and these AI challenges. If you did not answer this already, if you previously answered it, please ignore. But it looks like, yeah, if you're not in the room, Zoom doesn't give you the chance to do the poll. We're hashtag learning. Anyways, Karl, take us home. Take us home.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. Okay, so we'll move through this and we'll leave a good 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. So basically what I want to say first is I think it's important to acknowledge that AI is a tool. And what I mean by that is that it can be a positive force for good, and it very much can be a negative force for bad. And I think that depends on how we use it, right? So for example, we can use AI and machine learning models to reduce harm at scale by trying to identify, flag, and remove content, right? That's super important. And also can be a negative force because it gives bad actors the ability to create more sophisticated fake accounts and do things like increase spam or harmful content. It can be a positive force in the way that it gives new users or new people, or sorry, people new ways to create content, right? So generative AI is giving people really interesting ways to express themselves and tell creative stories. I saw someone using this new generative AI tool to like create a full storybook from scratch for their child. I think that's amazing, right? Similarly, if people use this in kind of a lazy, unengaged way, or even a deliberately harmful way, you can see how that would clearly reduce perceptions of feed quality, right? If we start to see a lot of low quality AI content or harmful AI content in our feeds, we might perceive the overall feed quality bad and disengage entirely. Similarly, it gives us new tools for reducing harm, right? Like the study I just talked about, where we use ChatGPT to actually change and reframe how people are getting their ideas across, right? And also, Pennycook AI have a really nice study that also came out this year around using automated chatbots to reduce belief in conspiracy theories as well. So these can really give us new tools for reducing harm. I think what's important is how we use these tools. And I'm going to focus on that because if we do this wrong, we can actually reduce trust overall, even when we're trying to have a good and positive intent. So we're going to look at a study that asks the question, how does the labeling of AI generated content affect people's perception of that content? It's important to tell people, right? And this is from work from Altai and Gallardi, by the way. It's a working paper at the moment. But it's important to tell people, right, when a piece of content is AI generated. But there's good ways to do this and bad ways to do this. In this experiment, what they looked at, they said, look, we're going to ask people to read headlines and rate those headlines for accuracy and their likelihood of sharing them. We're going to have people read 16 headlines, 8 are false, 8 are true. And some of the headlines are going to be AI generated and some are not. And some are going to be labeled as AI headlines and some are not. And we're going to measure these outcomes that we care about. And so the main manipulation that I'm going to talk about, there were about 5 conditions in this experiment in total, is looking at the contrast between what happened when these stories were explicitly labeled versus when they were not. And you can see the label they used here, right? Article generated by artificial intelligence. When headlines were labeled as AI generated, people actually thought that the article as a whole was less accurate overall. They reduced the likelihood of saying that this was accuracy on a 6-point scale by about 0.021 points on that scale. Right. And I think why this is important is if we look at how they did this, it might give us some insights into why this potentially backfired or caused an overall reduction in trust. Right. Even though our intent was to try and get people to understand that we're being transparent, that we're labeling these things as AI generated. First, this label might be slightly inaccurate. Right. It's saying article generated by artificial intelligence. If I'm reading this study correctly, I believe actually it was just the headline that was artificially generated, not the entire article. And if you think about what this is doing, right, it's drawing people's salience towards, it's making it salient that, hey, this was created by an AI, and not making it salient that other elements of the article, for example, the body text, were written by a human, right? So what we make salient, what we don't, is equally important. And so this is why I think testing and pre-testing is so important. All right, with that, we're going to move into the Q&A. As Ryan rustles up a couple of questions for me, and if you want to start posting questions that you want to ask in the chat, please do. We'll also allow people to come off mute and speak as well. But if you have a question, please drop it in the chat. While people are writing their first questions, I'd love to continue this conversation afterwards. Please feel free to sign up for our newsletter where we share interesting case studies and studies like the one we did today. If you have a slightly more sensitive question that you want to talk about, please feel free to use this Calendly link, and they're going to get dropped in the chat now to book 15 minutes with me. I'd love to have a chat. And as well, given the recent exodus from the platform that will not be named, feel free to follow me on Blue Sky as well at EF110 Econ, which was the first economics class that I ever taught. So not the catchiest handle, but that's why it's there. All right, with that, let's move into the Q&A. So please, if you have a question, drop it in the chat for me. I'll be more than happy to answer. Ryan, do we have any questions on the boil?
Yeah, nothing, no one has said anything yet. I was going to go into the Zoom responses to see kind of what's on people's minds, but also feel free to just raise your hand. We can take questions kind of in live in the moment. We can see everybody again. But yeah, I was going to ask you, Karl, just before as people are kind of bubbling up with their questions, what I was going to say is, what do you find? Oh, Brenda, you bubbled up you're in Mexico City, right, Brenda? Okay, Brenda works in real estate in Mexico City, I believe. Brenda, take it away before I ask a question. What do you got?
Well, my question is regarding the study with where they wanted to reshape the answer about gun control.
Yeah.
I was wondering what people was tested. I mean, how did they collected all these people? And because I found them very specific, to be honest, because usually this subject comes with a lot of passion. So yeah. I wonder, where do they get the people that answered these tests?
Yeah, so we can drop the link to the study with the full answer, but if I'm remembering correctly, it was just like a broad sample of the US population recruited through like online platforms like Prolific, for example. And they were told when they were signing up for the study that basically, you're going to be having discussions with people who might have opposing viewpoints to you. But it wasn't like, for example, that they went and recruited people from organizations that support reform for gun control and people who, are on the opposite viewpoint. It was trying to get a broader swath of the population.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I will go back and that study is dropped in the chat, but I'll go back and repost it in a moment. Temmie, would you like to come on and ask your question? Oh,
Yes,
Temmie did.
yes,
Oh, cool. Where,
yes,
where
I'm
are you,
here.
Temmie? Tell us all
Yes,
about you.
yes, I'm a product manager and I work with a bank in Canada, Calgary, and I build retail products. So basically, think of your personal banking apps. And one of the challenges, or at least the portfolio that I manage, is the access and security portfolio. And pretty much, we've always struggled with balancing security and safety with, building a great seamless customer experience. On one hand, you want to reduce fraud, we have that as one of our metrics, but also on another hand, we want to make sure that the client experience is as simple as possible while still keeping, their money safe and all of that. So that's where my question comes from is, what behavioral tactics have you found useful in this field?
Yeah, great question. This is a big struggle for anyone in the like fintech space, right? Like you've got so many requirements around know your customer and anti-money laundering and all of this stuff, and you need to ask some pretty detailed questions of people before they can sign up and use your platform. And how do you do that in a way that you don't totally lose everyone who's actually just trying to sign up and use it for good purposes too? I think there's a couple of things you can do. So one is providing rationale reasons for why you're asking these questions, right? It seems obvious, but like just providing little explainer text right underneath like the field where you're asking for it, explain like why do you need this and what it will and more specifically won't be used for, can help
Okay.
people, one, justify why it's being asked, and two, kind of reduce some of those like privacy concerns.
Yeah.
And then I think the other thing to think about is chunking, right? So you could give someone a very long form with like 40 fields on it and ask them to respond to each and every single one of those fields. Or you could split the fields across a bunch of different screens and give people the chance to kind of take a more relaxed approach and say, okay, I'm going to fill out these two answers, then the next two. And so there's some studies showing that chunking can help reduce kind of perceived friction as well.
No, that's helpful. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Awesome. Thank you, Temmie. We love having Canadians in the mix. It makes us feel like nicer people. Awesome. So with that, Dr. Gill, where are you at?
Hi, I'll jump on. Sorry, my video's not working. Yeah, my name's Rupert Gill. I've just moved to the US actually from the UK, where I've been doing behavioral science there, working in fact for Ofcom, where you drew a couple of your studies from. Yeah, my question was really about this balance about frictions and when frictions are like helpful and tolerated, and when frictions are not. And particularly, I guess, with those AI prompts for different phrasing. Yeah, I was interested if you know much about how people respond to them. Like, do they, to what extent do they find them helpful? What extent do they find them annoying?
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, again, so sorry that I miscited that study there. We'll make that change later on. But to answer your question, I think we know a little bit about this, but we don't know enough yet. So that study that I'm talking about, and even the Pennycook study, for example, they're all like out of product experiments, right? As you well know, like in these online environments where people are expecting to be as part of an experiment, or they're part of an experimental setup. I think what you are seeing is that this is probably going to become more normative over time, right? So we start with like the most basic and obvious and let's say controversial version. We have something like Grammarly, right? People are installing Grammarly as a browser extension, using it to like improve their writing. And then as we kind of move up the scale in terms of like using AI and to prompts to finish things, like I can't think of a major tech product that isn't starting to do this in some way, right? So LinkedIn is doing it to help you write your CV or to help write LinkedIn messages. You know, Gemini and ChatGPT are offering extensions so you can use them directly in things like Google Docs. I think this is just going to become more normative over time as AI becomes more and more prolific across things. And I think that will help make things like this more acceptable. But I think it would be nice to see an actual in-product experiment where we see what is the engagement with these features and the level of annoyance. And I think it's always about the way that you do it, right? So offering these suggestions, if you make it as like a hard stop where people can't continue until they make a choice, that might have one level of friction and perceived friction. And doing it as something that's kind of completely optional, that like, you know, it's showing as a prompt what you can post easily anyway without doing it, that might be another thing. So I think there are some questions we need to answer.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense.
Awesome. Thank you, Rupert. And then Avani, our last kind of question statement of the day. Although Rocco, you came in there too. Ugh. Okay. Let's see. Rocco, actually, can you ask yours? Do I say that right, or is it Rashko?
Always a wonderful, thank you. So Raiko
no,
works.
What's the right way? What's the right way?
Raiko is good, Rashko is as well. Whatever your tongue is capable of. Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure if this was a super concise write-up, but I'm thinking a lot about the perception of social media platforms these days, and what came up for me as I heard Karl going through the slides is, well, we're looking at specific interventions on a particular platform for existing users, and what I'm wondering about, do these interventions add up to a change in brand perception? Meaning, so does social suck, or TikTok in specifically suck, and it's not trustworthy with all the different comments and news media reports out there? Does that perception change given enough of those behavioral interventions, or does that need to be seen as something completely different, since we're really just looking at the specific platform behavior?
Yeah, great question. So let me abstract away from like specific tech platforms and just talk in the abstract about like a client that we did work with before. So one of the clients that we worked with in this space before, we did do some survey work to try and understand like what do people want from these platforms in terms of features that allow them to do things like filter content or you know, report things more easily. When you ask people what they want, at least they tell you they want these type of features. They're like, I actually don't want to see a bunch of misinformation. I actually don't want to see a bunch of hate speech in my feed, right? At least the vast majority of people are telling us these things. So my kind of answer from that jumping point will be that if people want these things and you supply them, that's most likely going to be a good thing, right? It might even be a negative perception if people kind of start to expect these things. If some platforms are doing them and others are not, they start to ask, like, well, why are you not doing these things? Like, why can't I improve my feed quality or remove the types of things that I want to from my feed? Of course, it's always going to come down to the very specific intervention. I will say, like, you know, from the work that we did with TikTok in particular around reducing misinformation, like, yes, does that kind of move wholesale broad perceptions? That's very hard to measure, but there was a lot of positive goodwill that came from that work, right? We wrote it up as kind of some PR pieces, and TikTok got a clear message to send that, hey, we're taking this seriously and we're testing these things. And I think it's good that platforms are being transparent and saying, hey, we're testing these things and being open about the results of our interventions.
Can I ask one quick follow-up here?
Ryan, are we doing okay for time? Yeah, go for it. Go on.
I mean, yeah, you know, I'm in that place too. Yeah, just go for it.
Thank you. I'm late for a meeting here as well, so we're both suffering a little bit. So what I'm wondering about then is, to what degree opinion about a certain kind of product is easier to sway straight from the get-go? Meaning, is getting it right in the first place way more important? Because once there's an opinion out there about what a certain product is or does or represents, it's much harder to sway that. It seems obvious, but I wanted to just, you know, run that against what you guys think.
No, it's a perfect question. Like, yeah, I again, I don't know if I have like an empirical answer, but like my theory brain is steering me towards like, you know, when people form a mental model of what your product is, how it works, and what it stands for, like that's the one that they have, and it's going to take much more effort then to change that later on than it is to build the right one from the start. And so it's not to say that, hey, once you've got an existing mental model in someone's head that you can't change it, but you do want to try and get this stuff right as much as is possible up front. I think, again, that's why pre-testing is super important, right? You want to test out these ideas in like an out of product online experiment, and then test them in product afterwards to confirm that they actually work as you expect. But you want to de-risk a little bit first before you introduce, for sure.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
No, thank you. And I think, Karl, we can close up by looking at Ivani's question or statement. And she says, trust and safety seems hard unless you first attempt to reduce friction between different stakeholder goals. Find common ground, yes? And I would say we both say yes, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think Ivani gave us a nice, we all want to find common ground with stakeholder goals and make the magic happen, just like Karl did today. So if you could give Karl some love in the chat, thank you so much for your time, genius, brilliance, and patience. And we have enjoyed hanging out with you this wonderful Friday, and we hope to see you next month, next year, down the road. If you want to hang out with us, you know how to do it. If you want to work with us, all the stuff is in the chat. You see it on the screen. We love hanging out with you, and hope the feeling's mutual. So go forth, be merry, and if you're in America, enjoy Thanksgiving holiday. So take care, everybody, and thanks again, Karl. That was my worst sound effect ever. like the
Thank
world's
you.
saddest